Ladies and gentlemen, Ian Livingston, Senior UX Researcher at EA Canada.
So this is going to be fun. I'm going to tell you a bunch of stuff that Andrew just told you not to do.
Also to the microphone.
I'm going to tell you to do a bunch of things that Andrew just told you not to do. Well, it's going to seem that way, but it's actually not. A lot of what I'm going to say is going to contradict him, but at the same time, I promise you it does support exactly what he's saying. It is about doing good research. Okay, so this talk is about doing research in game development and dealing with the constraints that exist within that work. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to share some of the techniques that I've learned over the years while I've been doing this that have helped me improve the way that I go about doing this work so that it is valid and rigorous to the best that it can be within what we're trying to do as games user researchers. And I'm also going to share with you just a general sort of approach that I have for doing this work and why I think it's sort of valuable. So before I get into that, I want to talk a little about who I am and why I feel that you should be listening to me and why I think what I have to say is important. I just realized that I actually can't see any of my notes, so do this off the cuff. All right, so my background, I came from a city in Canada called Saskatoon. It's in a province called Saskatchewan. Has anyone heard of this? Oh shit, really? Yes. Okay, so while I was there, I worked at an indie company. We made a game called Capsize. I did usability for them. I did play testing. It was a lot of fun. It was 3 guys. We were actually co-located. 2 of us were in Saskatoon. 1 guy was in Toronto. It was a great experience. After we finished that game, I'm going to keep moving around, so if I get too quiet, can you guys just yell at me if I get too quiet? Can you hear me? Okay. After that, I moved over to Ubisoft in Montreal, where I took on the role of project manager for the Far Cry brand. I was responsible for all the user testing and all the user research and all the analytics associated with that project. And we did a lot of great work. I worked on Far Cry 3, Far Cry 4, Blood Dragon, and Primal. But most recently, I took a step back and I took on a management role, and I've moved over to EA, where I manage a team of researchers there, and we actually work on a number of different projects. Now I'm responsible for research on FIFA, UFC, NHL, and the projects at BioWare. And the work that we do, we bring a lot of people into the labs. We run a lot of usability. We look at a lot of statistics. We look at a lot of player behavior, engagement, and what makes people tick and what they enjoy about the game. And it's been a long journey and a lot of fun. I've been doing it for almost 7 years. Okay, so why am I here? Actually, can I even see? Okay. So why am I here? I'm here to share with you the suspense. Ha! Don't touch the mouse, apparently. Okay, I'm here to share with you this idea of good enough research, okay? Now, I know I sort of said that the talk was about constraints, and it is, but the idea of good enough is my solution to dealing with a lot of these constraints that exist within industry research, but specifically games research. Okay. Here we go. Okay, we worked. And I still can't see my notes. Okay. So I'm going to start by talking about the constraints. This is going to be a fantastic talk. You guys are just going to watch me train wreck for 20 minutes. So I'm going to talk about some specific constraints. But there's a lot of constraints that go into doing research in an industrial setting and in a game development setting. So there's things like budget constraints, resource constraints, and tool constraints, but there's two that I really want to focus on, right? And the reason why I want to focus on these two is because they kind of work opposite each other. No, I got this. We're good. We're almost good. We're good. These two constraints. The first one, can it be done quick enough, that is research, so as to be useful? And the second one, can we still maintain a standard of rigor so as to be trustworthy in the work that we're doing? And the reason why we need to focus on these two is because doing it quick and useful is a very real and consistent business constraint that we have. We need to be able to deliver it in a timely manner so that the people who are waiting for that data and that research can action upon those results. If you're doing a study and it takes you a month to get those results, that decision's made. They did it without you. It doesn't matter. But at the same time, the work has to be trustworthy, because if it's not, then there's no point in doing it in the first place. So in essence, we have these two things, and they really end up being a balancing act. And just like this tightrope walker, we actually have tools that we can use to make that balancing act a little easier and a little safer. And I want to talk a little bit about these as we move forward. And when we actually get that balance right between rigor and time, that's what I refer to as this idea of good enough, right? So when you're hitting those things, you're doing good enough research. And the point that you have to be making, or that you have to be reaching, is that you have to be satisfied that the work that you're doing is trustworthy to the best of your ability, and you have to be communicating any kind of limitations that exist in that work. But at the same time, you have to be making sure that you're doing it fast. And when you get those together, it's good enough. Okay, so a little more detail about what good enough is. This is not good enough. I won't talk about the story behind this, but the thing about doing good enough research is that it's not about being lazy, and it's not about cutting corners. It's about understanding those tools that you have at your disposal and making the best use that you can from those tools. And it's interesting because it's very easy to think of research as this yes or no subject, right? That it's black and white. And as researchers, we often look at this as something that we're trying to prove, right? It's either significant or it's not, or we're rejecting a null hypothesis or we don't. And this kind of calls back to what Andrew was talking about, in that we're always trying to prove something, right? And the reality is that it's maybe not quite like that, right? If you're working on a development team, it's very likely that you've worked with people who have said, you know, I've done this work, and if you look at this specific number, if you're above it, you're good, and if you're below it, you're bad. And it's really not that simple, right? It's really this giant gray area. And fundamentally, when you're looking at this work, you have to decide whether or not you should accept the conclusion that's drawn. And again, like Andrew was saying, maybe 50% of it's garbage, but I like to think that, you know, if you're doing good, trustworthy work, that maybe it shouldn't be that bad, right? But the question that you want to ask yourself is, what is the risk of this outcome being wrong, right? You should ask yourself this as a researcher, you should ask yourself as a game developer, or anyone who's looking at this stuff. What's the risk of being wrong? And once you would kind of accept that you know, you're working in this giant gray area, you kind of free yourself to play with the risk, right? Because all of this is about risk. How certain are you about the outcome? And when you know that you can play with it, you can start thinking about it in new and unique ways. So, for example, you can consider this gray area as a scale, which is actually a kind of a cool way of looking at it. And on one side, you might be able to do something quick, but not particularly rigorous. So an example of this would be You run a study. You don't bother looking at the results. You just hand the results off to the people who ask you to do the study. And they can draw their own conclusions. And you can do that super quick, right? You can run a study in a day and dump out the results by the end of it. And then on the other hand, you can be exceptionally rigorous, and you're probably not going to be very quick. In this case, you take the time to be absolutely diligent in all the work that you're doing. You do the analysis really carefully, and you're absolutely confident in what you're saying, but you're not delivering it quick. So in this case, perhaps you deliver it after a month, and the team's like, cool, thank you, great. We already decided, we moved on. And if you're trying to do this idea of good enough, you have to kind of find yourself on this scale, right? You want to find that middle ground that's appropriate for you and the people that you're working with, that works on your timeline, but also allows you to be consistent. So I'm going to talk about two things that I found exceptionally useful. Okay, so the first one's is going to reference the ability to kind of save time explicitly in how you're doing it, and it's also going to contradict Andrew. Sorry. And then the second one is it's a technique that I use that actually helps you do something very quickly and is very communicative. Okay, so the first one that I want to talk about is confidence intervals. How many people are familiar with confidence intervals? That's probably less than half. Okay, so I'll explain them a little bit. Just so, okay. So the confidence interval is a way of illustrating a degree of uncertainty in a measure that you've taken, okay? And it's actually a great way to communicate with people to show that there's something that maybe isn't completely absolute in what you're doing. So I'll just show you what that looks like in very simplistic terms. So this is a mean. I made it up. This is made up data. And the white bar represents the confidence interval. This is a plus or minus some value that represents a degree of uncertainty that exists in the numbers. And if I was to tell somebody about this, exactly what does this mean, and I will read this so I get it completely right. If the procedure is repeated on multiple samples on the same content with the same player profile, at 95%, 1 out of 20 of times, the true mean will fall outside of the bars that were calculated. So basically that means if I measure same sample size, same group, same demographic, 20 times, 1 time, that purple bar will not be in that range. Pretty, and I'm dumbing it down because I'm sure there's some academics being like, no, that's not what it is. But that's a pretty good layman explanation of a confidence interval. We can accept that, right? Yeah, I see some of you nodding. That means you accept it. Okay. But let's break down what a confidence interval is actually made up of. Okay, so there's 3 parts that go into calculating a confidence interval: the standard deviation, the sample size, and your chosen alpha. And these things are either measured. In the case of the sample size, it's designed based on your study design. How you go about designing your study to figure out the appropriate level of power you need to be able to say what you want to say. And then your standard deviation is generally considered pretty standard. In this case, I assume most people have heard of like 95%, 0.05, that kind of stuff. But what I'm going to sort of argue here is that if you're playing in this gray area, maybe your standard deviation doesn't need to be measured. Maybe you could look at historical data that you have from a bunch of other studies that you've run to get a better idea. And the reason why you might want to do that is if you're perhaps playing with very small samples. Your sample size is designed, well, it's really not, especially if you're working in industry. There's a lot of factors that go into it. How big is your lab? How much time do you have to run the study? How many people actually showed up on the day that you needed them to show up on? It turns out a lot of people don't like to show up. And all of these things change it, right? It's nice to say like, oh, we're going to need 70 people, but 70 people are going to take me 3 weeks to run, so I guess I'll just do 10, because 10 is better than none. Which brings me to the alpha. It's standard, right? But why? I mean, why? We picked 95 because that's great for academia. We only want to be wrong 1 in 20 times, but if you're looking at this as a decision-making tool, it really doesn't need to be. You can play with it. You're working in a gray area. You can mess around with it. So what I'm basically getting at with this is that there's 2 fundamental questions that you're going to be looking at to try and answer. How precise do you want your measure to be? And how confident do you want to be in your measurement? And these 2 questions are actually very much about the risk of your study, right? The first one is how small do you want those bars to be in order to be able to say something that you want to say, and how confident do you want to be in those measures? So maybe you want to be 95% confident, but maybe you're happy being 75% confident. And that's enough to make a decision that you're trying to make. And all of this basically comes down to how much risk are you willing to accept. And the more risk you're willing to accept, the faster you can be, and which means that you can run fewer people, which means that you can get your results out in a more timely manner. So let's look at an example. Okay, super quick example. On the left, the purple, we're going to look at an 80%. On the right, the blue, we'll look at 95%. Purely hypothetical situation. Teams come to you and they said, we want to know if the thing that we've changed has made it better. Is it better? Okay. So you run condition A and you run condition B and you get these results. Condition A appears lower than condition B. And then at 95%, you get these great big confidence intervals. And then at 80%, you get these nice, tight confidence intervals. And basically, the only difference that exists here, sample size is exactly the same. We're just doing the calculation with slightly different numbers. On the one hand, we're saying at the 95%, maybe we wouldn't want to say that they're different. I mean, it's still a big difference, but maybe we wouldn't make that argument. Maybe we wouldn't be fully confident. But at 80%, sure, 4 out of 5 times, that difference will probably be there. So that's a pretty reasonable thing. I mean, I take an 80% bet. Would you guys take an 80% bet? Right? So that's probably good enough. So I can get away with that. I can be reasonably confident in what I'm doing. I can deliver it much faster than having a massive sample to try and reach that 95%. And as long as I'm communicating that with people that, look, we're accepting additional risk in order to be a little more confident in what we're saying, you can get away with this. Not that you should just be getting away with it, but we're playing in this gray area, right? Okay, I'll tab down. So let's talk about the second one, because I feel like I'm running out of time because I don't have a timer. Yeah, I'm getting tight. Okay. Second technique. Now this one actually, I think Andrew will agree with. This is the idea that you need to eliminate alternatives rather than attempting to prove an outcome. And this, for me, is really kind of a lightweight way of adding some additional rigor to the work that you're doing, right? It's about being efficient in your analysis so that you can save time and deliver quicker. It's about considering other alternatives to what you're seeing or what you expect to see so that you can eliminate them effectively. So let's look at an example. Let's say a team comes to you and they say, I think my game might be too easy. I want you to check. And I think it's going to be too easy because I think we've given players too much health. They have too much health, so they're not going to die. So check. And you're like, okay, sure. You get them to play the game. You ask them what they think of the difficulty. And they come back and they tell you, this game is too easy. And you're like, great, you were right. It's too easy. Turns out the player has too much health. Go ahead, reduce his health. Everything will be fine. But that's kind of lazy. The reality is that there's probably a bunch of reasons why the game might be too easy. And if you actually considered this stuff ahead of time, when you were actually planning your study as a researcher, you're identifying a number of alternatives that will actually allow you to be much more efficient in how you go about eliminating some of those alternatives. So for example, sure, maybe the player does have too much health, but maybe he's also doing too much damage, or maybe there's too few enemies, or maybe there's just one overpowered ability that players are making extensive use of. And if you start thinking about all of these alternatives in your planning, so that when you run your study, you can actually start coming up with ways to eliminate these systematically, right? You're looking for data that invalidates some of these conclusions rather than looking to validate one of your assumptions. So maybe for too much health, you can look at how often does the player die. Too much damage, you can look at how quickly enemies are being killed. Too few enemies, you can look at how much time they spend in combat. Overpowered abilities, you could potentially look at which abilities are being used. And you can start looking at these to see if there are things that are being abused. And what this is basically saying is that if you're a good researcher, then you should be trying to recognize as many alternatives as possible so that you can eliminate those to get to the most valid truth and the most valid outcome as possible, and give the most complete answer to the people that you're working with. And this is done by eliminating those alternatives that aren't supported, right? And fundamentally, you just need to build this into your planning. Okay. So let's wrap this up. Let's not wrap this up. Let's wrap this up. I'm gonna wrap this up. Yeah. All right. Okay. So all of this is basically to say that we're dealing with a balancing act, right? Both this idea of working in a gray area with confidence intervals and eliminating alternatives are working within these constraints, right? That we're trying to deliver something quickly, and we're trying to balance these business needs. And fundamentally, if you're delivering things in a quick and efficient manner, the people that are waiting for those results are going to be more happy, right? They're going to be happy that they get those results. They're going to be happy that they're making informed decisions, and that's important. And if the individuals who are doing this work, who are trying to run these studies, or just do quality research, as much quality research as you can, you're going to be more happy in that work as well, right? Because you're taking the time to be as rigorous as time allows you to be. And really a good balance of these two things leads to good quality work, right? And it's good quality because you're working within this gray area and you're hitting those business needs. So essentially what I'm arguing is that these constraints actually improve the quality. And the reason why it improves the quality is because this is better than either of the extremes. It's a great talk. This is better than either of the extremes of trying to deliver something far too quickly that you have no idea if it's correct, and trying to take all the time to be correct and delivering it far too late. And if you're delivering it quickly and confidently, then your communication is going to have a high degree of value. And if it has a high degree of value, then it's going to be of high quality. And that in and of itself is going to be good enough. Thank you.